Today, on this video, we're going to talk about Benjamin Harrison. Again, the point of this series of videos is discuss some little known presidents of the late 19th century. Benjamin Harrison was born in North Bend, Ohio in 1833. Family is a pretty famous family in American history. His grandfather, William Henry Harrison, had briefly served as president. Benjamin Harris, one of his great-grandfathers, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Historians generally consider him, growing up, not wealthy. He does grow up, eventually graduates from Miami University in Ohio in 1852. He studied law, moved to Illinois. When the Civil War broke out, he joined the Union Army, becoming a brigadier general. His most famous area of assignment, the 70th Indiana Regiment Infantry. He's known for having discipline and organizational skill. And like we've said in other videos, those late 19th century presidents, serving in the Civil War was a big deal. Ulysses S. Grant served in the war, combat veteran. Rutherford B. Hayes, combat veteran. Garfield, combat veteran. Chester A. Arthur was, he didn't serve in combat, but he was a quartermaster general in New York. And so he served that way. And so you see these presidents, being in the Civil War. That's a big deal. We talked about in the previous video, one of the knocks on Cleveland. He was a lawyer. He was a lawyer in New York during the Civil War. He actually paid his substitute $300 to avoid service. And so, that's going to be a knock on him. After the war, Harrison begins his political journey. He championed and ran as a politician and campaigned on veterans' rights, moral government, and national unity. In the early 1880s, he'd been elected to the U.S. Senate, where he supported typical Republican 19th century ideas: protective tariffs, civil service reform, black or African American voting rights. And this blend of moral idealism and nationalist economics would define his presidency. His first presidential run, 1888, he was running against the incumbent president, Grover Cleveland. As we talked about with Cleveland's video, Cleveland's tariff stance is what's going to be a big issue during the election. And this is... Cleveland argued for tariff reductions to lower prices and curb federal surpluses. Harrison, by contrast, defended protective tariffs, claiming they safeguarded American workers and industries from foreign competition. This is one of those famous elections where the winner of the popular vote does not become president because we're a constitutional republic, not a democracy, and not a direct democracy. And so... Harrison loses the popular vote to Cleveland. However, Harrison will win the Electoral College and become President of the United States. His term in office will be 1889 to 1893. His first Congress is known as the $1 billion Congress. Spend $1 billion. In the election of 1892, that's going to be a massive campaign critique of the Harrison presidency, whereas Grover Cleveland was vetoing everything in sight. You have Grover Cleveland signing a lot of spending, the $1 billion Congress. So that's going to be an issue for this. That's going to be a main 1892 campaign issue. On other economic policies and tariff issues, stood the McKinley Tariff of 1890. This law raised the average tariff rates to 50%. um, very high, highest in the U.S. up to that time. It included a reciprocity clause empowering the president to lower tariffs in exchange for favorable trade terms from other nations. And it's an early move. What's interesting about that is that's an early move towards executive-led trade policy and trade diplomacy. Traditionally, Congress handles tariff policy. The Harrison administration really dives into this reciprocity clause. Why that's important for you as current day students, this video is done in December 2025. President Trump in his, first and second term, but especially his second term, really big on executive-led trade diplomacy. And so it's one of the reasons why that's controversial is traditionally Congress is in charge of tariff policy. Benjamin Harrison kind of begins this conflict or tension between Congress and the president on who controls trade policy, especially with tariff issues. President Trump, our current president, obviously believes that the executive branch, the president, should control tariff issues and trade policy. Harrison signed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which required the government to buy millions of ounces of silver each month to inflate the currency supply. And that's interesting because Harrison's a Republican. He would be more aligned with the gold standard, but he will actually sign the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. This act inadvertently weakened confidence in the gold standard, which will set the stage for the Panic of 1893 in the Grover Cleveland second administration. As far as the antitrust and economic regulation, the president signed the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This was a very populist bill. Populists during the era argued that monopolies were stifling competition and stifling the U.S. economy. The moneyed interests were controlling politics and the economy. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, passed by Congress and signed by President Harrison, was aimed at combating monopolies. What's interesting about this one, it's never really used. McKinley and the McKinley administration, the Grover Cleveland administration don't really do much with this bill. It won't really be used until a generation later, during the Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressive era, is when the Roosevelt administration will drag it out from the dusty cobwebs of the archives and use it. Civil rights and voting reform. Harrison sought to revive federal commitment to black or African American voting rights through the Lodge federal election bill. If it had been passed, it would have allowed for federal oversight of congressional elections in the South. Something that the Grant administration, heavily enforced. The bill passed the House, was blocked in the Senate, and so it really kind of ends any attempt to oversee elections in the South until the 1960s. Veterans pensions and federal spending. Harrison was big on, like we mentioned earlier, veterans welfare. That's what he ran on. He constantly spoke about is taking care of our veterans, the Civil War veterans, right? Few issues were closer to his heart. He does sign the Dependent and Disability Pension Act, which extends benefits to Union veterans and their families. What's interesting about this one, regardless of whether their injuries were war-related. And this is part of that $1 billion federal budget, that $1 billion Congress, that is the Democrats in 1892 are going to hammer the Harrison administration over. Civil service and administrative reform, just like his previous predecessors, principles of civil service reform are important. He expanded merit-based appointments, professionalizing federal agencies. He oversaw a major modernization of the U.S. Navy, part of that billion-dollar Congress. America during this era, the goal of the U.S. Navy during this era was to become a two-ocean Navy, the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so Harrison's Congress, and he'll sign appropriation bills aimed at that. Foreign policy-wise, guess who is Secretary of State again? James G. Blaine, Secretary of State under previous Republican administrations. Blaine is back, Secretary of State again, and Blaine was an interventionist, a Pan-Americanist, and Harrison believes that. Harrison hosted the Harrison administration hosted the first International Conference of American States in 1889. It sought to promote economic cooperation among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. For historians, this is a precursor to what will eventually be organized in the 20th century, Organization of American States. And so it's a diplomatic, Western Hemisphere diplomatic initiative. Naval expansion, adopting a steel navy and a two-ocean navy. Unlike Cleveland, the Harrison administration supported annexation of Hawaii. He does sign the annexation treaty to move the annexation of Hawaii forward. As I mentioned with Cleveland will withdraw that annexation. And so you kind of see the differences. Cleveland is a non-interventionist. Cleveland rejected the annexation of Hawaii. He argued it was a special favor to sugar planters in Hawaii. That was one of Cleveland's slogans: "No special favors." Harrison, on the other hand, is a expansionist, an interventionist. So he supported the annexation of Hawaii. Harrison, like his predecessors, supported the Monroe Doctrine, this idea that the U.S. has a hand in Western Hemisphere diplomacy. Europe should go through the U.S. Europe should go through the U.S. if they have an issue with Western Hemisphere nations. What's interesting about Harrison, he personally supported black or African American civil rights, yet his legislative efforts were generally thwarted by Southern resistance and political calculation. His Native American policy, like his predecessors, is assimilationist. In the 1890s, in the 1880s and 90s, the idea for Native Americans was that they should assimilate. They should become American, meaning middle class European American farmers. And so the Dawes Act, which we see as an effort to integrate or assimilate Native Americans. They could get off the reservation. The federal government would give them land, and they're supposed to farm. They're supposed to be middle-class European American farmers. One of the more tragic events of 19th century U.S. history, the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, happened during his administration. And so that is, from our point of view today, that would not be a good thing about the Harrison administration. The election of 1892, as I mentioned, that billion-dollar Congress, the Democrat Party, the Cleveland campaign is going to hammer on that one. And Benjamin Harrison's wife was pretty ill during the election as well, and so historians generally argue that sapped his energy. He's running for president, running for re-election, but his concerns for family may or may not have influenced or hindered his ability to win.